3 weeks before my son's engagement party, I walked into a solicitor's office on Clarence Street, thinking I was there to update my will. Instead, the receptionist, a quiet woman named Bev, who had worked there for 20 years, grabbed my sleeve as I passed her desk and whispered, "Mr. Callahan, don't go into the meeting room yet, please. Sit in the archive room and don't make a sound." I told her that was ridiculous. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Your son is already in there, and you need to hear what he's saying before he knows you've arrived." I didn't leave. God help me. I didn't leave. My name is Walter Callahan. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years building a commercial plumbing business in Western Sydney. Watched my wife Margaret pass from ovarian cancer 2 years ago, and I truly believed, that my family was the one thing in my life I'd done right. My son Dominic is 31. My daughter-in-law-to-be, Priya, is 28. They'd been together 4 years, and I had welcomed her with everything I had. She reminded me of Margaret in ways I couldn't always explain. Quiet strength, eyes that notice things. I sat in that archive room with the door cracked open 2 centimeters, and I heard my son's voice through the thin wall. He wasn't alone. A woman's voice I didn't recognize spoke in a clipped, efficient tone. "The POA documentation is ready. Once the engagement celebration passes, we move to stage 2. The valuation reports are already prepared." Dominic answered, and his voice was steady, almost bored. "He won't question it. Dad trusts me completely. I handle all his business accounts already. He handed that over after Mum died." The woman continued. "And the property on the Central Coast? The one in Margaret's estate? Still in his name," Dominic said. "But not for much longer." I pressed my palm flat against the archive shelf beside me to keep myself upright. My legs had gone strange and hollow. Dominic kept talking. "The care facility is already selected. Dr. Hargreaves will provide the cognitive assessment. We've discussed the terms." The woman, I would later learn her name, was Renata Foss, a financial consultant who had been disbarred in Queensland 4 years prior, replied calmly. "And Priya?" There was a pause. "Priya thinks this is about protecting Dad's assets during probate," Dominic said. "She doesn't know the full picture. She's useful for now. Later she becomes a problem." I stood in that archive room for 11 minutes after they left. Bev found me there, handed me a glass of water with both hands the way you pass something fragile to a person you're not sure will hold it. She told me she had placed a small digital recorder on the underside of the meeting room table that morning. She had suspected something was wrong for weeks, ever since Dominic had called, asking her to prepare power of attorney documents without informing me directly. She was the one who had contacted my solicitor, Barry Hennessy, and Barry had told her to record whatever she could. Bev pressed a small USB drive into my hand. "There's 40 minutes on there," she said. "From today and from 2 weeks ago." I stared at it. "This tiny thing that contained the wreckage of everything. Your son has been here 4 times in the past 6 weeks, Bev said quietly. "Always without you. Always with her." I drove home that afternoon with the USB drive sitting on the passenger seat like a stone. I kept glancing at it. Every few minutes I'd look over, half expecting it to have disappeared, half wishing it had. The Pacific Highway stretched ahead, and I could not feel my hands on the wheel even though I could see them gripping it. Margaret had always said Dominic needed more from the world than it ever seemed to give him. She'd said it gently, the way she said difficult things, not as a criticism but as an observation. After she died, he had stepped into the role of managing my accounts with what I'd taken as devotion. He'd said, "Dad, you've got enough to worry about. Let me handle the financial side." I'd signed the limited business power of attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in August, 14 months ago. I had been grateful. I'd been a fool. That evening I sat in my study and copied the USB drive 3 times. One copy into my personal safe behind the bookshelf. One into a padded envelope addressed to my brother in Wollongong, with instructions not to open it unless I asked him to. One for Barry Hennessy, delivered by hand the next morning before Dominic was awake. Barry listened to the full recording twice. When he took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk, I knew it was serious. "Walter," he said, "you need a private investigator. Today, not tomorrow." He gave me a name. Judith Crane, former Australian Federal Police, 21 years. Now running a small investigations firm in Surrey Hills. Barry said she was thorough, discreet, and that she would not waste my time with sympathy she didn't mean. I called Judith from the car park outside Barry's office. She picked up on the second ring. She agreed to meet me that afternoon. Her office was on the third floor of a building that smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner. She was in her mid-50s, gray hair cut short, and she listened to everything I said without writing a single note until I finished. Then she wrote for 4 minutes straight. "Tell me about the property assets," she said. I laid it out. The family home in Penrith, fully paid off, valued at approximately $1.1 million. The commercial property in Blacktown where my business had operated, which I'd sold 18 months ago, but retained some proceeds in a managed account. Margaret's inheritance from her father, a coastal property at Avoca Beach, worth around $800,000. A self-managed superannuation fund, combined, somewhere between $3.2 and $3.5 million. Judith didn't blink. She had seen this before, I could tell. That was either reassuring or devastating, and I hadn't decided which. "The cognitive assessment doctor," she said. "Name? Hargreaves. I don't know his first name. I'll find him." She pulled out a different notepad. "And the woman, Renata Foss? That's the name I heard on the second recording." Judith nodded slowly. "I know that name," she said, and the way she said it told me everything about Renata Foss before she spoke another word. I was assigned a burner phone. Judith told me to use it exclusively for our communications. She told me not to change my behavior at home by a single degree, same morning routine, same conversations, same level of trust in Dominic. She said, "If he suspects you know, he'll accelerate. And when people like this accelerate, they get dangerous." I asked her what she meant by dangerous. She looked at me evenly. "You drive a lot for someone who lives alone. Country roads, mountain roads, brake lines are not complicated, Walter." I drove home that evening thinking about the highway. Living with knowledge you can't speak is the loneliest kind of suffering. Dominic came home that night with takeaway from the Thai place on the main road, the one Margaret had loved. He set it on the kitchen table, got out the good plates without being asked, and talked about the engagement party venue, a function room in the Hunter Valley. 200 guests, booked for the following month. He talked about Priya's family flying in from Melbourne. He talked about me giving a speech. I said, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Mate," he smiled. "Warm, easy, practiced." I smiled back. 3 days later, Judith sent the first file to my encrypted email account. Renata Foss, born in Brisbane, 52 years old, former licensed financial planner. License revoked in Queensland following a client fraud investigation in 2019. 3 complaints upheld by ASIC. A civil case brought by an elderly couple in Toowoomba who had lost $340,000 through a managed investment scheme she had constructed. The case settled out of court. Renata Foss had never been criminally charged. She had simply moved south, changed her consulting company name twice, and kept working. The second file was on Dr. Raymond Hargreaves, a psychiatrist with a registered practice in Parramatta. 2 complaints on his APRA record, both relating to competency evaluations in estate disputes. One assessment had been overturned in the NSW Civil and Administrative Tribunal. A bank record obtained through channels Judith did not explain showed a deposit of $85,000 into an account connected to a family trust in Hargreaves's wife's name, dated 6 weeks prior. The deposit source traced back to a company called Callahan Advisory Services Pty Limited, a company I had never heard of. A company registered in my son's name. I sat with that document for a long time. He had used my surname to name the shell company, as if he owned it already. The third file came 5 days later. It was the one that changed the shape of everything. Judith had a contact in Brisbane who tracked financial fraud patterns across the eastern states. He had found a case from 3 years ago. A retired schoolteacher named Colin Marsh, 69 years old, widower, living alone in a suburb of Brisbane. He had befriended a young man through a community volunteer program, a man who had introduced himself as Dean Whitmore, a financial advisor. Dean Whitmore had spent 8 months gaining Colin's trust. He had helped Colin reorganize his estate documents, had introduced him to a medical professional who assessed Colin as showing early signs of cognitive decline, and had established a management arrangement over Colin's finances before Colin fully understood what he had signed. By the time Colin's estranged daughter in New Zealand raised the alarm, $280,000 had moved offshore, and Dean Whitmore had relocated to Sydney. The photograph Judith's contact attached showed a younger face, lighter hair, a confident smile at what appeared to be a charity event. It was Dominic. I called Judith immediately. She answered, before the second ring. "I know," she said. "I was about to call you. He's done this before." "Yes." And Colin Marsh tried to report it. "The matter is still open with Queensland Police, but Dean Whitmore, your son, gave a false address and dropped contact. There was no warrant issued because the financial documentation made it appear voluntary. Colin Marsh signed everything." She paused. "As did you, Walter." I sat back in my chair. "Is Colin Marsh still alive?" I asked. "Yes. He's 72 now, living with his daughter in Auckland. She says he hasn't recovered." "Not really. He's functional, but the trust it took from him." Judith stopped. "He trusted this person, the way a father trusts a son." That night, Dominic asked me if I was sleeping all right. He said I seemed tired. He suggested I might want to reduce stress by stepping back even further from the business account reviews. He said he'd been thinking about setting up a formal family trust structure better for estate planning, better for tax, better for me in the long run. He slid a manila folder across the kitchen table. "Just have a read when you've got a moment, Dad. No rush." I picked up the folder. I nodded. I said I'd look it over. I didn't open it. I gave it to Barry the next morning. Barry called that afternoon. "Walter, if you'd signed this, you'd have had no legal right to your own superannuation fund. None. This document would have given Dominic sole trustee authority." I thanked him and hung up. I walked to the back garden and stood there in the late afternoon light and thought about Margaret. She had grown roses along the eastern fence. She had fussed over them every spring. They were overgrown now because I couldn't bring myself to cut them back to her shape. I stood among them and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening, just for those few minutes, because I knew that once I went back inside I would have to pick up the performance again. Dominic was planning to take everything. The home Margaret and I had built together, her inheritance from her father. The business I had spent 34 years constructing from a single van and a bag of tools. He was going to have me declared incompetent, have me placed in care, and then disappear into whatever life he had constructed for himself on the other side of it. And Priya didn't know. That thought kept returning. She doesn't know the full picture. She's useful for now. Later, she becomes a problem. What did that mean? Exactly. A woman who thought she was planning a future with someone. A woman I had come to care for. A woman who was going to be used as a stepping stone and then discarded, or worse. I called Judith from the garden. Priya, I said. What's her exposure? Judith was quiet for a moment. Her name appears on several of the documents Dominic has prepared. Nothing she's signed yet, but if the engagement party goes ahead and she executes the documents Renata Foss has drafted, she becomes a co-signatory to a fraudulent financial structure. She could face accessory charges even if she had no knowledge of the intent. She doesn't know, I said. That's your read, Judith said carefully. I'm certain of it. Another silence. Then she needs to be protected. Which complicates the plan, Walter. We had been building toward the engagement party. The plan was to expose Dominic there, in front of everyone, with the full weight of evidence. Judith had been in contact with the AFP Financial Crimes Unit through a former colleague. They were prepared to move on the day, pending my confirmation. The Callahan Advisory Services accounts were being monitored. A freezing order on the offshore account was ready to be executed. But Priya was a problem we hadn't fully solved. I made a decision. I called Priya on a Sunday afternoon when Dominic was at the gym. I told her I wanted to take her to lunch, just the two of us, and that I had something I needed to say before the party. We met at a cafe in Parramatta near the river. She arrived in a yellow jacket, her hair down, and she hugged me the way she always did properly. Both arms. The way Margaret used to say, was the mark of a person who meant it. I had rehearsed what to say 100 times. None of it came out the way I'd planned. I told her that I had discovered something about Dominic that had changed everything I thought I knew. I told her I had evidence. I told her the engagement party was going to be the moment I confronted him, publicly, with the full support of federal authorities. And I told her that her name was on documents she hadn't signed yet, but would be pushed to sign in the coming weeks, and that if she did, she would be legally exposed for something she had never intended. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, he asked me to witness his signature on some papers last week. He said it was just estate paperwork. He said your solicitor had already reviewed it. Barry never reviewed it, I said. Her face changed. The color left it. She looked out at the river and her hands on the table went still. He told me your memory had been unreliable since your wife died, she said slowly. He told me you'd had 2 episodes where you couldn't account for a period of time. He told me Barry was concerned. She looked back at me. I believed him. I held her gaze. Has my memory ever seemed unreliable to you? In anything we've talked about together? She thought for a moment. Then she shook her head, and I watched the full understanding move across her face. She cried quietly, with a composure that broke my heart more than weeping would have. She said she had noticed things she'd pushed aside. Dominic disappearing with his phone, certain financial conversations where he'd deflect or redirect, the way he'd subtly, systematically reduced her contact with her own family over the past year, always a reason. Always framed as protective. He's been isolating me, she said, almost to herself. I knew something was wrong and I told myself I was imagining it. You were not imagining it. I told her that clearly. I asked her if she would be willing to help. She wiped her eyes and sat up straight and said, "Tell me what you need." Judith brought a former AFP colleague named Stephen Tran into the operation. Stephen worked financial crimes and had seen structures like Renata Foss's before. He confirmed the account freeze would execute on the morning of the engagement party. He confirmed arrest warrants were prepared for Dominic, Renata Foss, and Dr. Raymond Hargreaves. He told me plainly that if Dominic sensed any change in my behavior before the party, he would likely attempt to execute an emergency document signing. And if that happened, the legal untangling would take years even with evidence. I asked Stephen the same question I had asked Judith weeks earlier, about the brake lines, about whether Dominic would escalate. Stephen said, "He's done this once before in Brisbane and got away with it. That makes him confident. Confident people get careless, but they also get ruthless when cornered. 2 days before the party, Dominic sat across from me at the kitchen table and slid a single piece of paper toward me. His voice was warm, his eyes were steady, and he said it was just a routine update to the superannuation fund trustee structure. Nothing significant, just a signature needed before the accountant's quarterly deadline. I picked up the pen. I set it down. I said, "You know what, mate? I want Barry to have a look at anything I sign these days. Not because I don't trust you. Just an old man's habit." I watched his face. For a fraction of a second, something moved behind his eyes. Something cold and fast, like a fish turning in dark water. Then the warmth returned. "Of course, Dad," he said. "Absolutely. No rush." He folded the paper and put it back in his jacket pocket. That night, I barely slept. The Hunter Valley in late autumn is extraordinary. Rolling vineyards, gray-green hills, a sky that goes on forever. The function room at Merindah Estate seated 200 people easily, with tall windows looking out over the vines. White flowers everywhere, long tables with candles already lit at 4 in the afternoon. I arrived early and stood in the entrance and thought about how Margaret would have loved this setting. She had always wanted to bring the family here for a weekend. We never did. I had the envelope in my inside jacket pocket. It held the AFP warrant documentation, the forensic accounting report, a printed transcript of the archive room recording, photographs taken by Judith's surveillance team of Dominic meeting with Renata Foss on 4 separate occasions, including once at an address in Randwick that turned out to be her private residence. A statutory declaration from Colin Marsh in Auckland, signed and notarized, identifying Dominic Callahan as the man who had defrauded him under the name Dean Whitmore, and a letter I had written to Priya. Guests arrived in the way guests do, cheerful and dressed well and completely unaware. Priya's parents flew in from Melbourne, her mother in a beautiful sari, her father with a handshake that told me he was a serious and decent man. I took him aside for 5 minutes before the formalities began, and I told him, quietly but plainly, that the evening might not go the way he was expecting, and that whatever happened, his daughter was safe and had done nothing wrong. He studied my face. He nodded once. He asked no questions. I respected him enormously for that. Dominic arrived, looking exactly as he always looked at important moments, effortlessly confident, wearing his charm like a good suit. He embraced me, clapped my back, thanked me for the occasion. He gave a short speech of welcome to the assembled guests that was polished and warm and made several people laugh and made Priya's mother wipe her eyes. I sat in the front row and I listened and I thought about 31 years. The little boy who had scraped his elbows learning to ride a bike on the driveway in Penrith. The teenager who had sat beside Margaret's hospital bed during her first round of chemotherapy and held her hand without being asked. The young man I had been so proud of, standing at his university graduation, squinting into the sun. How long had it been a performance? How long had he been someone I didn't know? The MC invited me to say a few words. I stood. I buttoned my jacket. I said, "I've been looking forward to this evening for a long time, because there are things I've needed to say, things that couldn't wait any longer." Dominic smiled from his seat beside Priya. I reached into my jacket pocket. I said, 3 weeks ago, I walked into my solicitor's office and sat in an archive room and listened through a wall while my son described exactly how he intended to steal everything Margaret and I spent our lives building, and have me declared mentally incompetent and placed in a care facility so that he and his financial associate could disappear with assets I'd worked 34 years for. The room went absolutely still. Dominic stood. His voice was controlled. "Dad, you're not well. This is exactly the kind of episode Barry and I discussed. Barry hasn't discussed anything with you about my health. I said. "I've just spoken with him, and Barry would like everyone here to know that the power of attorney documents my son has been preparing were never reviewed by this firm and were not legally sanctioned." I held up the envelope. "I have 40 minutes of recorded audio from my solicitor's office. I have a forensic accounting report showing $340,000 removed from accounts under my name through a shell company my son registered without my knowledge. I have a statement from a man in Auckland named Colin Marsh, who my son defrauded of $280,000 3 years ago under the name Dean Whitmore. And I have federal arrest warrants." Dominic turned to the exit. Stephen Tran was already there. 2 AFP officers flanked the door. "Dominic Callahan," Stephen said, "you are under arrest for fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence." The sound Dominic made as the handcuffs clicked, it wasn't rage and it wasn't regret. It was something flatter than both of those. Something that told me he had already known, somewhere, that this moment was always coming. He just hadn't believed I was capable of it. He looked at me once before they walked him out. "You've ruined everything," he said. I held his gaze. "You ruined it first," I said quietly. "I just refused to let it stay ruined." Renata Foss was arrested at her Randwick address at the same moment, 7 o'clock that evening. Dr. Raymond Hargreaves was located at his Parramatta practice the following morning and surrendered without incident. All 3 Callahan Advisory Services accounts were frozen before a single transfer executed. The offshore structure Renata had built collapsed without the incoming funds it was designed to receive. Barry recovered 94% of the assets that had already been moved. The remaining 6% was subject to ongoing tracing proceedings. Priya sat beside me after the officers left. The room had mostly emptied. Her mother had stayed, and her father, a few of my oldest friends. The candles were still burning. Someone had put a glass of water in my hand. "He told me your mind was going," she said again, like she was still testing the words to see if they made sense. "I know," I said. I almost believed him. She looked at me with something I can only describe as grief mixed with relief. "I almost signed those documents." "But you didn't," she shook her head. "Because you came to me first." She was quiet for a long moment. "He was going to leave me with all of it, wasn't he?" she said. "It wasn't a question. That was the plan." I said. "Yes." She absorbed that. Then she said something Margaret would have liked. She said, "I'm glad there are still people in this world who tell the truth when it costs them something." The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. The house in Penrith felt different in ways I couldn't name, not emptier, exactly, but more honest, like rooms that had been holding their breath could finally exhale. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Dominic's barrister entered a not guilty plea, which no one with access to 40 minutes of recorded audio found credible. Colin Marsh's statutory declaration, submitted as evidence of prior pattern and intent, was deemed admissible. The AFP Financial Crimes Unit connected Dominic to 2 additional instances of suspected fraud, one in Adelaide, one interstate via a property scheme, and those investigations were ongoing. The likely sentence, Barry told me, was 8 to 12 years. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected to feel when I heard that number. Mostly, I felt tired. Priya called twice in the first week. On the second call, she said she had begun seeing a counselor, someone who specialized in coercive control. She said she was starting to understand how thoroughly she had been managed, her friendships, her family contact, her own perception of reality. She used the word gaslighting, and I wrote it down afterward because I wanted to remember it, to understand what had been done to her with precision and not with vagueness. She asked if we could have lunch again sometime. Not to talk about Dominic, Just to talk. I said yes. On a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the arrests, I received a letter. Prison mail. Dominic's handwriting, which I would know anywhere because I had watched it develop from the clumsy print of a 7-year-old to the neat cursive of a man I thought I raised well. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It said, I had humiliated him. It said, I had chosen evidence over family. It said I would regret what I'd done when I was old and alone and had no one left. I read it twice. Then I took it to the back garden and stood among Margaret's roses in the morning light and thought about what was true and what was not. I was 67 years old. I had built something real and been willing to fight for it. I had protected a young woman who had been set up to take a fall for a man she'd trusted. I had found the truth before it was too late, which is more than Colin Marsh had been given the chance to do. I was not alone. Barry was a phone call away. Judith had sent a card. Bev from the solicitor's office had left a voicemail saying she was glad she'd trusted her gut. Priya's father had sent a short message that simply read, "Thank you for what you did for our daughter." I folded Dominic's letter and put it in my jacket pocket, not to keep, just to remind myself, on any day when doubt crept in, that the person who wrote those words was not the child I had loved. He was someone I never truly knew, and my grief for that, for the loss of who I had believed him to be, was real, and it was mine. But it was not the same as regret. I had one regret, and it was not acting sooner. The signs had been there for years. I could see them clearly now. The way Dominic had slowly repositioned himself between me and my accounts after Margaret died, framing each step as helpfulness. The way he had introduced Renata Foss as a contact of a contact, nothing significant, just someone worth meeting. The way he had, gradually, become the person I called first when something needed handling. Not because I was incompetent, because he had engineered it so carefully that it felt natural. That is what I want anyone who reads this to understand. Financial abuse of older people does not look like robbery. It does not arrive with threats or urgency. It arrives with warmth, with concern, with a son who books the restaurant you like and laughs at your old stories and takes the dishes off the table without being asked. It wears the face of love so completely that by the time you see through it, you have already signed half of what they needed you to sign. If someone in your life, family or otherwise, begins making themselves necessary to your finances, watch the pattern. Not the intention. The pattern. Good intentions do not require your signature on documents your own solicitor hasn't reviewed. Good intentions do not involve medical professionals you haven't chosen yourself. Good intentions do not ask you to trust them instead of the structures and the people you have trusted for decades. Keep your own solicitor. Keep your own financial advisor. Keep one person in your life, a friend, a sibling, a neighbor, who has no financial relationship with you, and who you can call when something feels wrong. And if something feels wrong, call them before you sign anything, before you agree to anything, before you allow someone's warmth to override your own clear-eyed judgment. Margaret used to say that the people who love you will never be offended by you asking questions. It was true when she said it, and it is still true. I go back to the Hunter Valley sometimes. Not to the function room at Merindah Estate, just to the valley itself. Early on a winter morning, when the mist is still sitting in the folds of the hills and the world is very quiet, I take a thermos and I sit in the car and I watch the light come up over the vineyards and I think about all the things that came close to being taken. They weren't taken. That is worth every difficult thing it cost.